Good day, everyone, and welcome to JK Michael's Knowledge Series. Today, we're going to be talking about planned business analysis governance. Right now, remember that we have talked about planned business analysis approach, planned stakeholder engagement approach. The next thing we want to talk about is the structure for authorization, for decision making, for passing on information, for gaining approval, for making decisions, for approving change, and what have you. So, what governance does is that it establishes structure for the business analysis work. The purpose of planned business analysis governance is to define or structure how decisions are made about requirements and designs, including how we will review, how we're going to make changes to requirements and designs, how we're going to gain approval, and how we're going to prioritize business analysis work. Now, it's very important that we have a governance decision in place as a business analyst, and if it is not very clear, we provide clarity and clear ambiguity to in any of the governance system. A governance process should identify who, decision maker, process how, information what will be required for decisions to be made and implemented. A governance process will define how approvals and prioritization decisions should be made, how do we approve and how do we prioritize requirements and design. When planning a governance approach, BA should identify how business analysis work should be approached and prioritized. What will be the process for proposing a change to business analysis information? Who has authority and responsibility to propose change? Who should be involved in change discussion? Who has responsibility for analyzing change requests? Who has the authority to approve changes, and how do we document and communicate changes? Very important. Structure. We want to know how to perform activities. Usually, governance would refer to a hierarchy, structure, and what a specific process for making decisions, for prioritizing, for authorization. Now, our input is going to be the BA approach created first, incorporating the business analysis approach into the governance approach. Make sure that business analysis and the business analysis approach properly describe the governance approach, and then the governance approach properly reflects on the chosen business analysis approach. There should be consistency. And then again, we have the stakeholder engagement approach. We want to understand the stakeholders' communication and their collaboration needs as it concerns the governance. How are they expected? What are they contributing in form of governance? And how should that shape how we organize them and determine communication and collaboration? So this engagement approach should be updated based on the completion of the governance approach. Right. So when we are clear on authorization for approval, authorization for review, and prioritization of stakeholders, we may end up going back to the stakeholder engagement approach to be able to update and change to reflect who has authority, who has the mandate to perform certain activities on the business analysis work. Now, the first element we have is going to be, so before we go, let's just document purpose, description, which is where we are, which we've been able to close, and inputs, right? Where we said our input is a stakeholder engagement approach and business analysis approach. Now, the next thing we want into is elements. And the elements, one of the first things we consider is decision making. Now, decisions are expected to be made throughout the initiative. A stakeholder is expected to serve in a lot of roles. He might be participating in decision making. He may be a subject matter expert leading the process and contributing knowledge to the decision making process. He might review information, and we might also have an approval of decisions. So when it comes to decision making, make sure that every role that would help us to be able to make good implementable decisions are considered. A decision-making process will define what happens when we cannot reach a consensus, identify escalation procedures or escalation paths, and the key stakeholders who should hold final decision-making. Now, the decision-making process might say, okay, we vote. What happens if it becomes a 50-50 and we have a deadlock? Then it should also happen what would happen what we should do when we cannot reach a consensus. How do we escalate, and who can veto or close up that? What actions can we take to close up that gap in decision making? right? When we are considering decision making again, we should also consider key aspects of decision making, like what are our causes of action, what is the cost and the time estimate of each of the causes of action, what's the benefits, what are the risks of each causes of action, and what is our priority, what do we have in mind, what's important to us with respect to that decision. Another thing we need to consider when we are setting up a governance process is the change control process. Now, remember, not everyone should have the authority to approve or implement a change, right? So before we can be able to be clear, part of our governance approach is to be able to clarify the process, rules, and requirements for making and implementing change, making a change or recommending a change, approving a change and implementing a change. We want to be able to determine the process, first of all, requesting a change, right? We want to specify the type of requirements and designs that would need to change, right? The change process, and also specify the requirements and design that the change process covers, determine whether the change process covers all types of change or only changes of a specific level of effort, right? So it will also recommend the process of what proposing a change, how they can be proposed, who should propose a change, and how we communicate the change request. Now, let me speak to the first paragraph. Now, sometimes we would just set a minimum standard of size or scope of efforts or effort for which we use a formal change control process. So, for instance, we can say that for changes that are not up to 10,000 US dollars or changes that do not affect the scope, schedule, or cost baseline of our project, then we don't need to do a formal change request. We just have, key stakeholders make a decision on whether to implement or not. But however, if the changes are of a larger size, of a larger cost, a larger level of effort, then we need to go through a formalized change process, right? So the whole idea is to specify the process for implementing, for requesting and implementing a change, right? What kind of changes do we request, raise a change request for, and go through the total change analysis process, right? What are the steps for proposing a change? When, under what conditions should we propose a change? Who has the authority to propose a change? And then what are the channels for communicating change requests? And I think we have cleared this up. We want to determine the elements of the change request, right? So in other words, when we make a change request, then what are the key areas that should be considered, right? When you're making a change request, possible areas to consider so that you can be able to support and simplify the implementation will be the cost of the change, right? The things you consider is what, how the change will be prioritized, right? So what is the basis of prioritizing? Because if you make a change, then you are proposing a change relative to competing interests, competing requirements within the initiatives that are running. So we don't just come in and then take the change you've recommended to the very top of the list. How do we prioritize? We don't also prioritize randomly. We should have a basis for prioritization that the team members or that the stakeholders agree upon. We want to also determine how we will document the change. Right? We need to be able to keep track of changes, whether they are approved and implemented or not, using configuration management system. We also need what traceability systems to establish what the baseline for our products are and how the change will impact these baselines. We want to also be very clear on the previous version, which is called version control, so that the version of the product or documents would change in a structured order, right? We want to have a version control practices that identify which baseline, whether it's product baseline or documents baseline or information baseline that have been affected by the change. Another thing we want to consider is how do we communicate change when proposed change, when someone proposes a change, who proposes the change and what channel is the change communicated through. When a change is under review, how do people know, right? When a change has been approved, how do we communicate that? When a change has been declined or deferred, whatever decisions are made on the change should be communicated. We also want to determine who will perform impact analysis. Now, changes should not be approved without consideration of what the impact will be on stakeholders or the initiative. So we want to specify who will perform impact analysis on the proposed change and its effect on the initiative, on the project, and on stakeholders. Finally, we'll determine who will authorize change. There should be a designation of someone with the authority to approve changes and what business analysis information their authority covers. So if maybe a particular stakeholder is in charge of approving changes relating to security and regulatory requirements, other stakeholder might be with the authority to approve changes that relates to probably the scope coverage or customer or stakeholder requirements or customer or user needs, right? So it's very important to determine who will authorize change as per the designation and what business analysis information the authority covers, so that someone who doesn't have the right authority to deal with a certain kind of change, maybe regulatory change, doesn't go and make changes or approve changes to regulatory requirements. And then we'll plan a prioritization approach. Now, remember that requirements, designs, and business analysis information would be prioritized. And there are a lot of factors that impact what we place at the top of the priority list and what we place at the bottom. Factors like timelines, expected values, dependencies, resource availability, and constraints, adopted methodologies, and other factors will influence how we prioritize requirements and design. When we are setting up a process to be able to standardize and agree on the prioritization process and the basis of prioritization, things we need to consider will be the formality and the rigor of the prioritization process. Should it be an informal process where people vote, do a very simple vote? Should it be a very formal process with formal documentation, formal prioritization system, and formal decision making? Now, what are the participants that should be involved in the prioritization, and why do we select these participants? Do they bring any value to the prioritization process? What process will we use to determine how prioritization should occur? What techniques will be utilized? Do we use Moscow or what other technique? And what criteria do we use for prioritization, like timelines, expected value, and what have you, right? The approach should be determined. Which stakeholders want to be able to be clear on which stakeholders also will have a role in prioritization. Again, the approach will go a long way to help us understand which stakeholders should be involved or have a role in prioritization. Another thing we'll do in governance is that we plan for approval. And approval formalizes the agreements between all stakeholders, and the content and the presentation of the requirements and designs are accurate. So when we approve, right, it shows that all the stakeholders agree that the content and the presentation of requirements and designs are sufficient, right? They're adequate, and we can use them to do further work, right? So after requirements and designs have been captured, after they have been cleaned up, after they have been specified and modeled, after they have been presented in a way that allows us to do work, then stakeholders come together and agree upon them, thereby formalizing that, okay, we the stakeholders have agreed that these requirements and design have been captured in a way that is accurate, adequate, with sufficient detail, and effective for the work to be done. Now, the timing and frequency of approvals would depend on size and complexity. Again, whether you are doing a predictive or adaptive, you can see that it will significantly affect the timing and the frequency of approval, right? Dependent on the size, the larger the size, the more the risk, the more the complexity of the change, the more tendency we'll have, again, to tilt towards predictive, where most of the approvals will be gotten at the start of the business analysis work, right? If there are another thing we consider is the associated change of foregoing or delaying an approval can make us to bring approvals forward and or make approvals more frequent. So you want to think about the timing and the frequency of approval based on what are the realistic risks and concerns of regarding the approval process. Now, the business analyst must determine the type of requirements and designs to be approved, the timing of the approval, the process to follow to gain approval, and who will approve the requirements and design. For guidelines and tools, which is the next thing we have come into, have guidelines and tools. We have the business analysis performance assessment, which, like I said, is used for continuous improvement. Results of previous assessment that should be reviewed and incorporated to improve our planning approach. We have business policies that will give us limits around which decisions should be made. Right. Now, sources of business policies can be regulations, contracts, agreements, warranties, certifications, and legal obligations. Right. Always consider them when you are setting up an approval process or prioritization process. For instance, if you were building an app, a banking app, security and the protection of stakeholder requirements is very important because of regulations and laws. So because of that, we must prioritize them. We must make sure that we make provisions for effectively prioritizing the security of people's financial information. The current state description will provide us with understanding of the context where the work should be completed. Is there an existing org chart? Are there already existing rules and responsibilities that we must consider and respect in the governance process? This would help us to be able to define how to make better decisions. And then again, we have legal and regulatory information. Are there legal rules, legislative frameworks that should be followed and that can help us to be able to shape our governance framework to ensure that we make good decisions? And then let's consider techniques. We have brainstorming to generate a list of potential stakeholders who may need approval roles in the governance process, document analysis to be able to evaluate existing governance processes and templates that we need to adopt or use. We use interviews to identify possible decision-making, change control, approval, or prioritization approaches. We also use that to be able to identify participants and individuals or groups that can be able to help shape the governance approach. We use item tracking to be able to track any challenges or issues that arose when planning the governance approach. When items are tracked or identified, our goal is to resolve them and communicate the resolution so that the planning can go on smoothly. We use lessons learned to be able to find out if there are past lessons, right? If past initiative gave us valuable lessons, whether they were positive or negative, that we can leverage in planning our governance, right? Where the experiences in governance planning and governance implementation that we can draw from for our current and future initiative. We use organizational modeling to be able to understand. We look at the org chart to be able to better understand roles and responsibilities within the organization and how they may apply to a governance approach, right? You want to make sure that roles and responsibilities are applied or attached to the right stakeholders that have the right, contextual understanding, the right governance mandates, right? A lot of times you will start from the org chart to be able to know, okay, who holds this position and why should this person be suitable for a governance role. We have process modeling to be able to document the process and the method for governance analysis. We use reviews to be able to review the proposed governance plans with stakeholders, because of course we will not set up the governance plan and implement it by ourselves. We need key stakeholders to be able to bless and agree upon the proposed governance plan. We use surveys and questionnaires to identify possible prioritization approval and possible approach and participants. So the approach and the participants for decision making, change control, approval, and prioritization should be identified using surveys and questionnaires. And finally, we use workshop to identify again approaches and participants for decision making, change control, approval, and prioritization. The only difference is that this is going to be done in a team setting. We use a workshop to be able to bring the stakeholders in collaboration to identify approaches and participants in decision making, change control, approval, and prioritization. And that is where we get to techniques, right? We've been able to resolve the techniques part. Now, let's look at the stakeholders. Of course, we'll have the domain subject matter experts that can, give us insights um, on requested change and may even be involved in change discussions, can give information or insights that can help us to be able to clarify the impact of a change. We have the project manager that works with the business analyst to ensure that our project governance will align with the business analysis governance so that we do not have maybe a different stakeholder for on the project side for approving requirements, and then we have a different stakeholder in the business analysis side for approving requirements, leading to clashes. So there should be alignment, right? We have regulators that may impose rules or regulations that needs to be considered when determining the BA governance plan, right? In sensitive industries, again, like banking, like pharmaceuticals, like aviation, the regulator may impose rules or mandates around certain factors that must be considered or certain things that must be put in place when setting up the governance plan. They may also be source of what change requests. And then the sponsor may impose their own requirement on how business analysis information should be managed. Participants in change discussions can be suggested by the sponsor, approved. The sponsor might also be expected to approve certain kinds of changes. So we want to consider all these stakeholders in the light of the role they will play in the governance approach. And then we've closed out the stakeholders. Let us go to the last one, which will be our outputs. We have dealt with stakeholders. And then the output is going to be the governance plan. Now, let's look at that. The output. Output will, of course, be the governance approach. The governance approach will identify, I want you to notice the things that we're going to highlight here because they're very important. Governance will identify who has responsibility and authority, all right? Who has responsibility and authority to be able to take decisions about business analysis work, who's going to be responsible for setting priorities, which is prioritization, who be responsible for approval, who be responsible for what? Changes, approving changes, prioritizing, making decisions concerning what? Business analysis information, whether they're requirements, designs, or any other type of information. It will also define what process will be followed to be able to identify requirements and designs, prioritize, approve, and take decision on them, and how we are going to manage requirements and design changes throughout the initiative, the change, or the project. And this brings us to the end of business analysis governance approach. And I hope you understood how important structure is to setting up a business analysis or to planning a business analysis. So I hope we understand how important structure is to planning, performing business analysis, planning, and monitoring, and why the governance approach is a key way to ensure that you put in that structure. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video when we will talk about how we can plan business analysis information management. We'll look at what a business analysis information is and how best do we manage it with respect to business analysis initiative or change. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.